When my hand first began to tremble, I thought it was just fatigue, too much work, too little sleep, but the real shake didn't come from my body. It came from realizing that while I was losing control of myself, I was also losing control of the life I'd built and maybe the person I built it with. When I first noticed the tremor in my right hand, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion. I had been working long hours at the design firm, finishing a project that felt like it might finally get my name on the boardroom wall. Coffee had replaced sleep, stress had replaced exercise, and my body was probably just reminding me I wasn't 20 anymore. That's what I told myself, at least. The tremor was small at first, just a faint vibration that appeared when I lifted a pen or typed for too long. It came and went, like an uninvited guest who occasionally knocked on the door to make sure I hadn't forgotten him. I ignored it the way most men ignore the first signs of something they can't explain. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. It only made it worse. By the time my wife, Laura, noticed, the tremor had become an almost constant twitch. She reached across the breakfast table one morning, her eyes filled with concern, and asked if I had been sleeping enough. I told her yes, even though I hadn't. Then she asked if I'd been drinking more coffee lately. I said no, even though I had. We left it at that because Laura had always been the kind of person who respected silence more than confrontation. That was 3 months ago. Last week, the neurologist said the words that now repeat in my head every time I wake up. Parkinson's. He said it gently, almost apologetically, as if the softness of his tone could blunt the edge of the diagnosis. I nodded, thanked him, and walked out of the hospital with a handful of pamphlets that I never read. The world outside felt too bright, too alive for what I had just learned. People were laughing. A child was chasing pigeons across the parking lot, and I was standing there trying to accept that my own body had quietly declared war on itself. I didn't tell Laura right away, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't know how to start that kind of conversation. There's no handbook for how to say, "My hands won't always listen to me," or, "You might have to help me button my shirt someday." The words didn't come easily. They stuck in my throat like stones. So, I pretended everything was normal. I went to work, smiled at my colleagues, nodded through meetings, but my focus was gone. The tremor had become a metronome that dictated every thought, every hesitation. I caught myself staring at my own hand like it was something foreign. It's strange how you can live with a part of yourself for decades and suddenly feel like you're meeting it for the first time. At home, Laura started picking up on my distance. She thought I was stressed about work. I let her think that. It was easier than admitting the truth. I thought I was protecting her from worry, but deep down I knew I was protecting myself from seeing the look in her eyes when she realized what was happening to me. That look came anyway, just not for the reason I expected. One evening, while she was taking a shower, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I swear I wasn't. The notification just caught my eye. It was a text from someone named Nate. I remember the name because it wasn't familiar, and because of what it said. Just 5 words. "Can't stop thinking about you." I froze. My first instinct was denial. Maybe Nate was her coworker and the message was about a project. Maybe it was an old friend. Maybe it was anything but what it looked like. I stood there staring at her phone like it might start explaining itself if I waited long enough. Didn't. When Laura came out of the shower, I didn't ask about it. Couldn't. I wanted to, but something inside me cracked quietly. I told myself there was probably an innocent reason, but when she walked past me that night and smiled, it felt rehearsed. Her smile used to reach her eyes. That night it didn't. The tremor in my hand returned, stronger this time. It wasn't just my nerves or the diagnosis anymore. It was the weight of something unspoken, something I didn't understand yet. I went to bed before her and lay there listening to her moving around in the living room. When she finally came to bed, she thought I was asleep. I could hear her typing quietly on her phone. The light from the screen flickered across the wall like a heartbeat I couldn't calm. That was the first night I realized I wasn't just losing control of my body. I was losing control of my life. The following week stretched into something that barely resembled time. It wasn't days or hours anymore, but long stretches of pretending. Pretending to be fine at work, pretending to sleep, pretending that Laura and I were still the same people we had always been. Every morning I would wake up before her and lie still listening to her breathing and wondering how much of her life I had already lost without realizing it. At the office, my coworkers noticed that I had become quieter. The usual small talk over coffee faded away, replaced by nods and polite smiles that never reached my eyes. My right hand had started to betray me during design sketches, so I began relying more on digital tools that could hide the instability of my line. I told everyone it was a creative decision, but really it was just damage control. I had become an expert in disguising decline. At home, Laura seemed busier than ever. She was always tapping away at her phone or talking in another room with the door half closed. She said it was about work deadlines, which made sense because she was in marketing and her hours had always been unpredictable. Still, there was something different in her tone when she spoke to whoever was on the other end of those calls. It wasn't her usual professional briskness. It was lighter, softer, almost like a melody she didn't realize she was humming. The strangest part was how ordinary everything else looked. We still ate dinner together, watched a show before bed, and traded short updates about our days. It was all there on the surface: routine, normalcy, familiarity. Underneath, though, it felt like walking across thin ice, knowing the cracks were already spreading underfoot. I decided I couldn't keep avoiding the truth about my diagnosis forever. I needed to tell her. But every time I rehearsed it in my head, the words dissolved before I could imagine her reaction. I kept picturing her pity, the way her face might twist into sympathy she didn't want to show. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be someone she could rely on, and now the idea of her seeing me as fragile felt unbearable. One Friday night, she said she was heading out for a work dinner. She asked if I wanted her to bring anything home afterward. I told her I was fine and would probably just read for a while. As she was leaving, I caught a whiff of a perfume I didn't recognize. It wasn't hers, not the one she had worn since college, not the one that always lingered faintly on my pillow when she left for work early. This one was sharper and floral and unfamiliar. After she left the apartment, I sat on the couch for a long time doing nothing but listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself she deserved the benefit of the doubt. But my mind wouldn't stop replaying that message from Nate and the way she had smiled when she thought I wasn't looking. Eventually, I picked up her old tablet from the coffee table. It wasn't locked, which felt both innocent and suspicious at the same time. I didn't go looking for anything specific. I just wanted proof that my imagination was running wild. I wanted to find something ordinary, something that would make me feel foolish for doubting her. Instead, I found a folder of photos from the office holiday party a few months earlier. She had never mentioned it. I scrolled through them slowly, faces of people I half recognized, colleagues I had met once or twice. Then I saw him. A man standing next to her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling in a way that didn't look posed. There was something about the way she leaned toward him that made my stomach tighten. I looked at the caption someone had written. Laura and Nate, always the dream team. There it was, the name that had haunted me for weeks. I closed the tablet and placed it back on the table exactly as I had found it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The tremor had spread to my left hand now, and it felt almost poetic that even my body refused to let me stay still. When she came home later that night, she smelled faintly of wine and rain. She told me the dinner had gone late and that she was exhausted. I just nodded. I didn't ask questions because I wasn't ready for the answers. I wasn't ready to hear her lie, not yet. That night I dreamed I was walking through an empty train station holding a ticket I couldn't read. The departure board kept flickering between destinations and every name blurred together until it meant nothing. I woke up drenched in sweat with my heart pounding and the faint sound of her whispering into her phone in the living room. The thing about secrets is that they don't stay still. They expand quietly, filling every empty space between two people until there's no room left to breathe. I could feel ours growing by the day. The morning after that uneasy dream, I decided to see my neurologist again. The first appointment had been a blur of clinical words and gentle sympathy that I couldn't quite absorb, but now I needed clarity. I needed to know what to expect, what this illness would take from me, and how fast it would happen. The doctor explained everything carefully using diagrams and timelines while I sat there nodding like a man watching someone describe the dismantling of his own house. He said I was still early in the progression, but the symptoms would intensify over time and there was no cure, only management. He suggested medication, physiotherapy, lifestyle adjustments. None of it sounded like control. It sounded like delay. Driving home afterward, I couldn't stop glancing at my hands on the steering wheel. The right one twitched slightly against the leather. The left one gripped harder to compensate. It struck me that this was how my life was going to look from now on, constantly adjusting, hiding, compensating, pretending to steer straight while everything pulled in the wrong direction. Laura called while I was at a red light, asking if I could pick up groceries on my way home. Her voice was bright and casual, the same tone she always used when she wanted to sound normal. I said sure and hung up before she could ask where I was. I didn't want to tell her I had spent the morning talking about how my body would slowly stop obeying me. At the store, I wandered through aisles without purpose. The world around me felt oddly distant, like I was watching it through glass. People were rushing, choosing things, comparing prices, living their ordinary lives without realizing how fragile it all was. I envied them. I envied their ignorance of how quickly normal could vanish. When I got home, Laura was already there, sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. She looked up and smiled when she saw the bags in my hands. I noticed she had changed her hairstyle, slightly shorter around the edges. It suited her, but it also made her look like someone I didn't fully know. She thanked me for the groceries and went back to typing. I asked if she had a busy week ahead, and she said yes, then mentioned something about a conference out of town next month. My stomach tightened, though I kept my tone even as I asked where it was being held. She said Chicago and added that she would probably go with a few coworkers from her department. I didn't have to ask who. That evening after dinner, I told her I was going for a walk. The air outside was cool and the streets were quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. I walked without direction, ending up by the small lake a few blocks from our apartment. The reflection of the streetlights shimmered across the surface in long, trembling lines that reminded me of my own hands. I stood there for a long time, watching the ripples fade into darkness. Something in me began to shift that night. Up until then, I had been living between two secrets: my illness and her affair, both of them heavy, both of them corrosive. But as I watched the water move, I realized that silence had turned me into a bystander in my own life. I was waiting for time or circumstance to make decisions for me, and in doing so I was disappearing. When I got home, Laura was asleep. Her phone was charging on the nightstand, glowing faintly. I could have picked it up, I could have scrolled through the messages and confirmed everything I already suspected. But I didn't. For the first time, I understood that knowing more wouldn't change the truth. What I needed wasn't proof. It was a plan. The next day, I started making small changes that I didn't tell her about. I opened a new savings account in my own name. I called an old friend from college who worked at a smaller firm and asked about openings. I even scheduled an appointment with a therapist, something I had never considered before. It felt strange taking steps that might not lead anywhere, yet each small action gave me a sliver of control back. Laura seemed unaware of my shift in energy. If anything, she looked relieved that I had stopped asking small questions about her schedule. She probably thought I had accepted things as they were. I let her believe that. Sometimes the easiest way to hide your plans is to act like you have none. One night, she mentioned casually that she might stay late at the office the following Friday. I said sure, just text me if it gets too late. She smiled and kissed me on the cheek. It was a brief, familiar gesture, but it felt hollow. I wondered if she noticed that I didn't flinch when she touched me, that I didn't cling to the moment the way I once did. I was already beginning to detach, quietly, methodically, like a man loosening ropes before a storm. That Friday, I would follow her after she left the office, not out of revenge or curiosity, but to confirm something inside me that I already knew. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes, not because I wanted confrontation, but because I needed closure. At least that was the plan, though I couldn't have known how far the truth would reach or how it would tie itself to the illness that was already reshaping my life in ways I hadn't yet imagined. Friday arrived like a weight pressing on my chest. All week I had rehearsed what I would do, where I would park, how I would follow her without being noticed, and most importantly, how I would stay calm no matter what I saw. It felt absurd to be planning something like that at my age. I wasn't a detective, I was an architect whose body was beginning to betray him, and yet here I was tracing routes on a city map like a man preparing for a mission he didn't want to complete. Laura left the apartment just after 6, wearing a navy coat I had bought her 2 Christmases ago. She told me she would be at the office late finalizing a presentation for a client and that she might grab dinner with her team afterward. Her tone was practiced casual, not a single pause or hesitation. I nodded, pretending to scroll through my phone, while the sound of her heels faded down the hallway. 10 minutes later, I took my car from the garage and drove downtown. Her office building stood in a cluster of glass towers, all reflecting each other in endless repetition. I parked across the street behind a row of delivery vans and waited. The tremor in my right hand had grown worse lately, and the steering wheel still vibrated faintly from it. I rested my hand on my lap, trying to keep it steady while I watched the building entrance. At 7:20 she came out. But she wasn't alone. A man walked beside her holding an umbrella, though the rain had stopped an hour earlier. I recognized him from the photo on her tablet. Nate. He was taller than I expected, with that polished confidence people in marketing seem to cultivate like a second skin. They stood near the curb, talking closely, heads tilted toward each other as though sharing something private. I expected anger, jealousy, humiliation, something raw and sharp, but what I felt instead was a strange, detached calm. The scene unfolding in front of me looked almost rehearsed, two actors repeating lines in a play that had been performed too many times. Eventually a cab pulled up and she got in while he stayed behind, waving as it drove away. For a moment I thought she was going home, but the cab turned in the opposite direction. I followed at a distance through the slow Friday traffic until it stopped outside a quiet restaurant near the river. Through the window I saw her meet someone else. A woman this time. Older, mid-50s, maybe, neatly dressed with silver hair pulled into a bun. They hugged tightly and sat facing each other. Laura's expression softened into something I hadn't seen in months. They talked for nearly an hour. I stayed in the car watching the light from the restaurant flicker across the windshield. When they finally stood to leave, I saw Laura wipe her eyes before hugging the woman again. My confusion deepened. This wasn't what I expected. She didn't look guilty or secretive. She looked relieved. Curiosity won over caution. Once they left, I walked into the restaurant, pretending to look for someone. The waiter confirmed that the woman had paid for the meal and left in a rideshare just a few minutes earlier. On a quiet impulse, I asked for the name on the reservation. He checked his tablet and said softly, "Dr. Ellis." That name stopped me cold. Ellis was the neurologist I had seen twice in the past month. The same one who had told me about my condition in his soft, deliberate tone. Driving home that night, I tried to piece it together. Why would my wife be meeting with my doctor? How would she even know him? I hadn't told her his name. Unless he had reached out to her directly, which could only mean one thing. She already knew about my diagnosis. When I got home, Laura was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled tiredly, asking if I had eaten. I said I wasn't hungry and went straight to the bedroom. My heart was pounding, not from anger now, but from the terrifying realization that the two secrets I had been keeping weren't separate threads after all. They were part of the same knot, and she had been quietly untying it without telling me. I didn't confront her that night. I needed to be sure. The next morning I checked the call log on our shared tablet. There it was, a number saved simply as Drive E. The earliest call dated back 3 weeks, the day after my last appointment. She must have gone through my papers, found the hospital letterhead, and called him. Maybe she had suspected something, maybe she had known all along. The irony was cruel. I had spent weeks hiding my illness from her to protect her from worry, while she had probably spent those same weeks hiding her knowledge of it to protect me. That afternoon she mentioned casually that she might visit her mother soon for a weekend. I just nodded, watching the tremor ripple through my hand. She looked at me quietly for a moment, then reached out and covered my hand with hers. The gesture was simple, but her eyes were wet, like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. For the first time in months, I didn't pull away. I still didn't know what her connection with Nate really was, or why she hadn't told me about the doctor, or why her guilt looked more like sorrow than deception. But I knew the ground had shifted. Whatever truth I had been chasing wasn't the one I was about to find. Over the next few days, the rhythm of our lives changed in small, nearly invisible ways. Laura became gentler, quieter, more deliberate in her movements around me, as if she were walking through a museum of fragile objects. She asked how I was feeling a little too often and left glasses of water near me, though I hadn't asked for any. The questions I wanted to ask her kept building behind my teeth like pressure behind a dam, but I kept them there because I needed to see how far she would go before she said anything on her own. One evening after dinner, she mentioned that she had taken the next Friday off work. She said she wanted to take me somewhere peaceful. I asked where, and she said it was a surprise. Her tone was careful, almost rehearsed. She had been planning this. I nodded, pretending to accept it easily, though every part of me was already restless with curiosity. That Friday she drove us north out of the city, along a stretch of quiet highway lined with tall bare trees that swayed like slow metronomes in the wind. We didn't speak much. The silence between us felt thick, but not hostile, just full of things neither of us knew how to begin saying. Eventually we pulled into a gravel driveway that led to a small retreat center by a lake. The sign outside read Willow Creek Restorative Haven. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cedar and tea. A woman greeted us and handed Laura a set of forms. I realized this wasn't a romantic getaway or even a vacation. It was a therapy center that specialized in degenerative illnesses and caregiver support. My stomach tightened as I pieced it together. She had known everything for weeks, maybe longer, and instead of confronting me, she had quietly signed us up for help I hadn't asked for. When we sat down in one of the meeting rooms, the counselor began by thanking us for coming and then asked if we were comfortable sharing what brought us there. I didn't answer. I just looked at Laura. She took a slow breath and said she wanted to help her husband cope with his new diagnosis and help herself learn how to support him through it. Hearing her say it out loud made the truth real in a way it hadn't been even at the hospital. The word Parkinson's hung in the air like a faint vibration that wouldn't stop. After the session, we walked outside along the path near the water. The sky had turned pale orange, and the air carried that crisp scent of early winter. I finally asked her how long she had known. She didn't pretend not to understand. She said she found the hospital envelope in the recycling bin weeks ago, and that she couldn't bear waiting for me to tell her. She called the doctor because she wanted to understand what we were facing before I had to say it out loud. I asked why she hadn't confronted me sooner. She said she was waiting for me to be ready, that she thought I needed time to accept it myself first. She had wanted to protect me from my own denial, just as I had been trying to protect her from worry. It was like we had built two walls facing each other, both meant to shield and both ending up as barriers. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me Nate wasn't who I thought he was. He wasn't a coworker or a lover. He was a volunteer coordinator from a support foundation that paired patients with therapists and resources. She had met him through Dr. Ellis when she called to ask for guidance. He had been helping her find programs and workshops for couples dealing with chronic illness. She said she hadn't told me because she didn't want me to feel like a project to be managed. I stood there listening to her voice blend with the wind off the lake. I didn't know whether to feel relief or shame. I had been so sure of her betrayal that I had stopped seeing the small kindnesses that had still been there. Every late night, every whispered phone call, every message I had misinterpreted had been part of her effort to hold things together while I was quietly unraveling. We drove home in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence this time, not filled with suspicion but with exhaustion and something close to understanding. When we reached our apartment, she rested her head against the steering wheel for a moment before turning to me. She said she knew I had been keeping my distance and that she couldn't blame me. Then she told me that she loved me, but she didn't know how to reach me if I kept shutting her out. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything I had assumed and everything she had carried alone. I realized how quick I had been to believe the worst when the truth had been much simpler and more human. People hide things not always because they're guilty but sometimes because they're scared. The next morning I made coffee and placed her mug on the table before she came out of the bedroom. When she joined me, she looked surprised to see me already dressed and smiling. I told her I had something to show her later, a small project of my own. She didn't ask what it was, just nodded quietly, like she understood that I was finally ready to meet her halfway. I didn't tell her yet that I had already applied for part-time work at the smaller design firm, or that I had been thinking about selling the apartment to move somewhere quieter. For now, it felt enough to know that the silence between us had changed shape. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge waiting for us to cross. The following weeks settled into a strange rhythm that felt both fragile and new. The air in our apartment was lighter somehow, though neither of us said anything to name it. There was still tension beneath the surface, but it had softened into something more manageable, like a bruise that no longer hurt to touch but still reminded you where the injury had been. Each morning I woke early and took slow walks around the neighborhood. My doctor had advised daily movement to keep the muscles steady, and I found it soothing to trace the same route along the tree-lined streets while the world was still quiet. The tremor never disappeared, but I had stopped hiding it. I let it be what it was, a reminder that I was still here, still trying. Laura started joining me, sometimes bringing 2 travel mugs of coffee and matching my pace even though hers was naturally quicker. She had begun reading about the disease on her own and would share small things she learned: new exercises, new diets, new research. I could tell she was trying to help in every way she could, but what mattered most wasn't the information, it was the effort. The act of showing up every day was its own kind of medicine. One evening she asked about the project I had mentioned weeks before. I told her it was something small, just a redesign proposal I had been working on for the smaller firm. She seemed genuinely excited and said she was proud of me for keeping at it. Then she added that she had a surprise of her own. She said she had been in touch with someone from her company's wellness program and that they were interested in funding a local awareness event about Parkinson's led by employees. She wanted me to help design the space for it. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to stand in public as the face of something I was still struggling to accept. But her enthusiasm was contagious, and in the end I agreed. Working on that project gave me a sense of direction I hadn't felt since the diagnosis. I found myself sketching again late at night, drawing slow, careful lines that wobbled slightly but still found form. It wasn't perfection, but it was honest. Every stroke carried a small tremor, and I decided not to correct it. The imperfections felt real, and real was enough. As the event approached, Laura spent more evenings at the office coordinating logistics. For the first time in months, her absences didn't fill me with suspicion. Still, there was something about her energy that I couldn't quite read. She was calm yet determined, with a focus that bordered on secretive. I told myself she was simply trying to make everything perfect, but part of me wondered if there was more she hadn't said. The night before the event, she came home late carrying a folder and a tired smile. She said everything was ready and that she couldn't wait for me to see it. Then she reached into her bag and handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed itinerary for a short trip scheduled for the following month. It was a week-long stay at a lakeside retreat upstate. At first I thought it was another therapy session, but when I looked closer I realized it wasn't that at all. It was a residency program for artists and designers living with chronic illness. She had already submitted my portfolio without telling me. The email attached to the confirmation said I had been selected as one of the participants. I didn't know what to say. The gesture was enormous and unexpected. She said quietly that she wanted me to remember who I was before everything started falling apart, that maybe this would help me find that version of myself again. I felt a tightness in my throat that I couldn't put into words, so I just nodded and pulled her close. The event the next day was held in a converted warehouse filled with soft lighting and simple exhibits. There were panels on new treatments and displays of artwork from patients and caregivers. Laura moved through the space with easy grace, greeting people, thanking volunteers, adjusting details I hadn't even noticed. I stood near one of the installations watching her talk to a small group and realized how much I had underestimated her strength. When she saw me, she came over holding 2 cups of cider and handed me one. She said she had one last thing to show me. She led me toward a corner where a large photo board stood, surrounded by small lights. On it were candid pictures of us taken over the years, our travels, our home, our wedding, even a few from recent weeks that I hadn't realized she had captured. Beneath the photos were the words "still building together." It was the slogan for the event, but it was also her message to me. I felt something shift quietly inside me, then not a rush of emotion but a deep, steady warmth. For so long I had been afraid of what the future would take away. Standing there, I saw how much it could still give back if I let it. When we returned home that night, I found her asleep on the couch, still holding the folder of event papers. I covered her with a blanket and sat for a while watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. It hit me how close I had come to losing her, not because of betrayal but because of my own fear of facing what scared me. I didn't wake her. Instead, I whispered something into the quiet of the room that I hadn't said in months. I told her thank you. She didn't hear it, but maybe she didn't need to. The next morning I would find another envelope waiting on the kitchen counter. It would change everything again, but not in the way I feared. I found the envelope next to the kettle in the gray quiet of early morning, and the sight of my name written in her careful hand felt like the soft click of a door that had been waiting to open, and I knew before I lifted the flap that this would be one of those small turning points that does not shout yet changes everything just the same. Inside there was a thin stack of papers and a folded note, and for a moment I only looked at the edges because I wanted one last second of not knowing, and then I drew a breath and began to read, and the first page was a confirmation from a research center upstate that I had been accepted into a trial designed to slow the kind of unraveling that had already begun inside me, and there was a schedule and a stipend and a line that said the foundation would cover transport and lodging, and I saw the name of the volunteer coordinator at the bottom, and I smiled at how wrong I had been about him, and at how patient she had been with my fear. The second page was a short lease, and it was for a studio near the retreat by the lake that we had visited, and the dates matched my residency and the trial window, and there was a small sketch attached that showed wide windows and a long table and open shelves and a simple chair with arms that would help when my balance fought me, and I could see it in my head so clearly that it made my heart ache in the best possible way, because this was not a space for waiting, this was a space for making and living and failing and trying again, and I could imagine the light moving across the floor through the day as I worked slow and steady among the tools I still knew how to use. Her note was written without flourishes, and it said that she had been up late learning how to do hard things that did not come naturally, and that she had signed forms and asked questions and called people who knew more than either of us, and that she believed we could build something inside the shape of what was happening rather than standing on the shore watching the tide pull our plans away, and there was a list of small tasks I would need to do, and each one felt manageable and honest and human. And I realized that she saw our future not as a cliff we were falling from, but as a new path with rough stones and narrow turns that we could still walk together hand in hand. I sat at the table with those pages spread out like a map, and I felt a steadiness begin somewhere behind my ribs, the kind you get when you finally stop pretending that you are fine and instead accept that you are scared and that you can still move anyway. And the kettle clicked off and the room filled with the thin white breath of steam, and I thought about the first time my hand had shaken and about the weeks I had wasted staring at shadows that I had painted myself, and I felt an embarrassed tenderness toward that earlier version of me who believed control was the same as certainty. She woke a little later and saw the papers and touched my shoulder, and I told her that I understood what she had done and that I wanted all of it, and that I would still be afraid some days, and that this was not a promise to be wonderful or brave all the time, but a promise to stay present and to keep walking. And she nodded and looked away for a second, and I could tell she was crying in that way where the face barely changes and only the eyes give it away. And we stood there in the soft light with the city still half asleep, and I realized that love sometimes looks like a porch light left on for hours while someone you care about circles the block looking for the right address. The weeks that followed moved with an odd mixture of speed and slowness, the way a river can look still from far away and then rush when you step near the bank. And we packed the basics for the studio, and we made a simple calendar on the fridge, and I told my team at the smaller firm that I would be remote for a while, and they told me to take what I needed, and I started the trial, and the nurses were kind and efficient, and there was a rhythm to it that made the fear quieter, because habits have that power, and my hands still trembled, though sometimes less than before, and in those calmer moments I traced careful lines on heavy paper, and I let the tiny wavers stay because they were part of me now and not enemies to be scrubbed away. On the first morning in the studio, I opened the windows and the lake smell drifted in faint and cold, and I set the chair where she had marked a small X on the floor with blue tape, and I taped the paper to the table, and I began to draw the outline of a simple chair that would not tip when knees weakened, and I thought about all the people who might need such a chair, and about the quiet dignity of design that makes life a little easier for someone who is tired of asking for help, and I felt useful. And I had missed that feeling more than I had admitted even to myself. In the evenings we walked the path by the water, and she asked me what I wanted tomorrow to look like rather than next year, and I found that this question was kinder because it did not ask me to wrestle the unknowable, and I told her I wanted a long breakfast and an hour in the studio and a nap in the late afternoon and maybe a board game after dinner, and she laughed softly and said she would learn to like losing again, and I teased that she never did, and then we fell quiet in that warm way that means nothing is missing, and I thought about the long year that had brought us here, and how easily I could have broken us by clinging to suspicions that were easier to manage than the truth of my own fear. There are still hard mornings when my body feels like a house with old wiring and lights that flicker for no clear reason, and on those days I sit with a hand curled around a mug that shakes, and I remind myself that trembling is not the same as falling, and that love is not the same as rescue, and that control was always a story I told myself so I could sleep, and I find that acceptance is quieter than I expected and more powerful than I believed, and I keep going because small progress feels like a kind of faith. We returned to the city after the first round of the trial, and the studio lease stayed open, and we promised each other that we would go back often, and the event slogan still hangs above my desk, and I look at it when the day wobbles out of balance, and I think about how buildings stand because forces that would break them are redirected through beams that know how to carry weight, and I realize that this is what we are doing now as a pair and as two people who learn to stop hiding their fear from each other. If there is a lesson I can offer, it is only this, and it is simple enough to fit on a scrap of paper, and it is that life will shake sometimes, and you will learn to keep drawing lines anyway, and the lines may bend and loop and blur, yet they still make a picture if you let them, and in the soft light of evening, when the work is done and the kettle sighs and the city hums through the windows, you may find a quiet that feels like grace, and you may understand that forward does not always mean far, and that enough can be a beautiful word when it is spoken with care.